Wow, thank you for the warm welcome this morning and yesterday, and for the fabulous food and company. I'm going to talk this morning about an amazing experience that I have had in my life. In the late 90s, I was recruited by a member of our governor's cabinet to take a job where my job was going to be a translator, a liaison between communities in our state and state government in order to reduce the rates of 7 major social problems. And so you know something about me when I said, yes, sure, I could help reduce the rates of 7 major social problems: child abuse and neglect, substance abuse, dropping out of school, youth suicide, and on and on. And when I took that position, I said, you know, I've worked in local government as an elected official, I've worked as a community organizer, I live in a geographic area where there are 2 American Indian nations. I've witnessed their strength and their power, and I can't be in this role unless you delegate to me, Governor, the operational authority to work with respect for those communities. So I will bring to you all of the policy decisions, but I will not give you operational authority. I'll need to operate in a way that makes sense given the people that we're working with. Amazingly, they said yes to that. And we went on a journey to learn more about how do we partner, what does collaboration look like with communities that are as diverse as independent American Indian nations and communities from urban to suburban to rural to frontier that have experienced many, many different kinds of social challenges and inequities and grace and strength. And the first thing that I decided was that I couldn't possibly know enough to know what should be done, that only those local communities would need to know that. And so I needed to have a completely different way of working with community. And so I'm going to talk to you about that adventure and just let you know that underlying all of it was an ongoing interest and study about how the earth heals, how do oceans heal, how do forests heal? How do all living systems heal on this earth? And can I open the space for that kind of healing throughout the people in the area where we live? So I started thinking of this as self-healing communities, communities that are honoring those natural processes. And we started thinking more about if we're in a position where we have these many social problems and health problems, those must be coming from culture, not meaning ethnicity, but meaning the everyday way we're relating with one another, individually and collectively. And so we started thinking about culture change. And so what do I mean by culture? I mean these things that are abstract, we learn them, we share them, and they're the rules and standards and patterns that help us really interpret what's going on and know how to behave with one another. And culture is really something that provides us with a lot of comfort. You know, we get fluent. We know when we come to a conference, we're going to have to sit in a chair for a long time. We're going to listen some. We're going to ask questions. We're going to maybe get to dance at night, right? All of those things that we begin to understand and we're fluent with gives us comfort. We don't have to be thinking through all of that in order to participate. And that's what makes cross-cultural work so challenging, is that some people are having to think through and other people are fluent, and then we switch gears and some people are having to think through and other people are fluent, right? And so we have ease with our comfort, with our culture. And so when we think about culture change, we're talking about moving from a stable, steady state of being where we're fluent and we kind of know how to behave and interpret and respond, to a whole nother steady state where we can be more invested in healing and well-being and the ancient traditions of our people. And along the way, when we move from one steady state to another, regardless of whether we're talking in physics or human relations or community development, it doesn't matter what living system we're talking about, we're always going to go through a period of volatility. So I like to think of that as when we're changing from the steady state of liquid in water to the state of gas, steam, what would we do? Well, we'd probably put some water into a pan, we'd put it on a heat source, we'd turn on the heat, And along the way, that water would become very volatile as the bubbles captured the oxygen and eventually captured the steam, the new emerging form, the gas. But along the way, that could be bubbling and jumping out of the pan. And if we were close to that pan, it might even jump onto us and hurt, right? That volatility is a part of the transition from one steady state to another. And our instinct is to turn down the heat. But if we want to change from one state to another, we actually have to turn up the heat. And we tend in society to get to that place of volatility, that uncomfortable space where we can already almost feel that new state. And we know intellectually or even in our hearts that it's going to be better, but it's really uncomfortable. And we start to turn down the heat. And so I begin to think maybe my job as a full partner with communities was to help them in that moment notice the volatility as simply the transition and help them turn up the heat. The issues that I talked about yesterday are so complex. You know, we talked about historical trauma and intergenerational adversity and the accumulation of different kinds of adversity affecting us as human beings. We talked about sensitive developmental periods when experience has such a profound effect on who we become and how we relate to one another and the world. We talked about the progression of adversity, and implied in all of that was the phenomenal cost, both financial and the human costs of the adversity that we experience. And I didn't mention much, but in our country, as probably in yours, we have variation in the amount of adversity people are experiencing. In some of our communities, we have 50% of the people have had 3 or more different kinds of major adversities growing up, and in other communities, about 10 or 11% have that. So we have to operate differently in communities where we have populations with lots and lots of adversity. And resources are finite. We just simply don't have enough resource to be investing anymore, one problem at a time, when we know something about the common origins of many problems. We can foster change in the entire culture, shift to a new way or to an ancient way. The most important thing is to a self-healing way that can sustain healing over time. And the good news is communities are really powerful. In fact, throughout the ages, we've always turned to community. Regardless of our age, we've always turned to community. And Gregory Cajete, a well-renowned Native researcher, says that community is a living spiritual entity supported by every responsible adult. And so herein lies my mission. Over the 17 years that I was in this amazing position of being able to be a translator, a liaison, my job was to translate community speak to policy speak, and policy speak to community speak, and help communities turn up the heat. And in that role, you know, we were constantly thinking about how do we engage every responsible adult? How do we build the capacity of communities to solve these really difficult problems? Because if community can't solve it, no one can. We're pretending that policy can do it. It can't. Community is where it can be solved. And so we started thinking more about living systems and how we tap the skills and connections and shared responsibility and identity, our sense of self in the world, in order for communities to be able to build these protective spheres that I talked about yesterday, these nested spheres of people's capabilities, their sense of belonging, and their sense of healthy community, culture, and spirituality. In the end, we realize that our systems are kind of upside down. We have systems where professionals think that they're in charge. And actually, the people most affected by adversity are the most powerful people for reducing adversity in the next generation. That's where the power is actually held. And so we began to see the professionals in our various systems as supporting the people most affected by adversity. And that was the essential element, this sense of expanding leadership to everyone who wants to help, to everyone with an interest in future generations experiencing well-being. And our communities, over a fairly short amount of time for human services, for social services, for health, had really stunning success. I'm going to show you briefly, and then I'm going to talk to you about how that success was generated by communities. So here are some charts. The green lines are the 42 communities, including 10 tribal nations and 32 non-tribal communities. The green lines are their trend lines over time. The red lines are the rest of the state where I work, Washington State, minus King County, which is where Seattle is. We always have to take the biggest city out of our data because otherwise you can only see Seattle, right? You can't, the data washes out everyone else. So I just want to show you the trend lines on juvenile alcohol arrests. You can see starting up above the rest of the state and plummeting below. Drug arrests coming down more rapidly than the state. Arrests for violent crime crossing the state line. We had dropping out of high school. This is the yearly dropout cycle starting way above in the communities where we were investing in self-healing and coming way down below the state. This is the cohort, the freshman to senior 4-year cohort dropout rate, plummeting compared to the other communities. Child out-of-home placement coming up in both arenas, but coming up much more slowly in communities where we were using self-healing principles. Births to teen moms plummeting in our communities, and child suicide coming down while it was going up statewide. These stats are really amazing, but what was more amazing was that in our communities that were consistently using the principles of living systems to invest in healing, those communities had 5 or more of these problems coming down all at once. They didn't have to wait one by one by one and argue about which resources they got to use for which problem was more important, because we're human beings. We can't separate these problems out one at a time. They're our experience in community. We had huge savings, and we continue to enjoy those savings for programs that in the United States are called entitlement programs, programs that government would automatically need to spend money on, we no longer need to spend money on, because people just don't have the problems at the same rate. We had long-term savings that were phenomenal, but more important to our public officials were we had real-time savings. Most prevention investments, you have to wait 10 years before you get the savings. We had real-time savings because our communities were making these sensitive decisions about how they invest in healing day by day, not waiting 10 years. But what about tomorrow? What about the day after? Why focus on culture change? It's because we're creating culture moment by moment in the way we're interacting with one another. And our experience together is shaping risk, it's shaping healing and protection, and our collective experience is shaping the capacity we have for solving these really tough problems. And so we have to focus on shifting the way we're experiencing life with one another to a new steady state that is a state of healing and no longer a state of increasing adversity over time. So we began to really look at complexity science. For those of you who know ancient wisdom, you will recognize all of these principles in that wisdom. And that's why I said yesterday, we're living at this amazing time when we're bringing together ancient wisdom with a new science to help us develop a common language that can bridge across these different cultural systems. And just briefly, I want to mention in complex systems like communities, like the human body, a simple change can produce a profound difference. The truth is, we don't have the ability to have some top-down decision-making. In fact, all of the independent actors in a community are going to act. And it's the collective action of all of us that creates the reality. And so we cannot use command and control systems. They just simply don't work. There are attractors. I think of them as magnets. And when we find them, we can invite that shift to a whole new way. And what happens is our behavior over time tends to cluster, likes like, right? We like things that are similar. And so when we begin to surface that and name it and say, we're attracted to each other, but is it what we want for our great-grandchildren? and question that and name it and build a common language about this, then that brings us to the power of feedback. And feedback I'll talk a little bit more about. I'll talk a lot more about it probably in tomorrow's workshop. But this is the idea that the actions of today will bring about actions for tomorrow, and the actions tomorrow can bring about more of that healing that we wanted. We can build feedback in our systems that will generate exponential change, exponential healing opportunity for our people. And lastly, fractals. Most of you know about fractals, and I see you wear this lovely symbol of the fern, one of the most amazing examples of fractals. But we can look at the detail of life and see also a mirror of the large of life. And so when we begin to be tired in our careers, we can step back for a moment and look at the whole. Or when we get tired in the whole, we can step forward for a moment and look at that infant. And we will see the truth in both. And so we don't have to get tired. We just have to shift perspective. And that will help us build healing in our communities. So I want to say that in every country where we've looked so far, we see that the ACE scores of young people have gotten higher and higher and higher each 10-year cohort. This is not a good thing, right? We know ACEs lead to many, many problems, and our collective action is making matters worse. And this is my best shot at understanding how that might be happening. ACEs are leading to adaptation, and society tends to respond to that adaptation by kicking people out, punishing them, labeling them, diagnosing them, etc., imprisoning them. And what that does is lead to a pileup of adult adversity. And we know that childhood adversity plus adult adversity has a profound impact on functioning, and that leads to more ACE problems and higher ACEs for the next generation. I think this is the cycle, the feedback that we've been in for a long time without naming it, without having language, without being able to talk about it. But I think a simple change can make a profound difference. And so let me just show you this virtuous cycle that I believe is the future for our investments, and that we can structure things as dry as contracts and compliance and those kinds of things that are sort of the nightmare of us administrators. We can structure them to make this profound change into reality. So ACEs are still going to lead to adaptation, right? That's biologic, that's epigenetic. Adaptation, though, can be met with a different societal response. We can respond with a right fit engagement. Whether you're the person who's afraid to leave your home, you can still make the reminder calls for the meetings in order to engage in your own leadership in life, right? If you're the person who lives in a community with certain resources that are mostly spiritual, then shouldn't your spiritual resources be the ground of the healing of your community, right? If you live in a community with tremendous wealth, shouldn't that wealth be included as part of the resource, right? Can we get a right fit between the place where people are and the people that live in that place? And that right fit will lead to flourishing, less ACE attributable problems, and lower ACEs for the next generation. So we focus not on the adversity of individuals. We focus not on the adversity in communities. We focus on the right fit, the incredible genius and wealth and humanity and spirit of the people and place where the work is being done. All of this work is local. And so those of us who work at a national level or a regional level, we have to be in the role of creating the local space where healing can occur in that right fit way. So we used that philosophy and we learned over time what was it that helped create that space. And we found 4 variables that were really vital. The first was, were we and our partners expanding leadership to everybody that wanted to help? Everybody who wants to help is a leader. We have to throw out whatever the other definitions are. They're old definitions that have to do with hierarchy. Instead, can we just think in terms of anything you would like to do to invest in healing and in the well-being of future generations and this generation? You're a leader. And so we want to know your core gifts. we want to engage your core gifts, and we want to see that ever expanding in our efforts. The second critical factor we found was the ability for people to take the time and energy and space to really focus, meaning like the focus on a camera. We're going to see more clearly the dynamics that are leading us into the challenges that we're experiencing. And we can really focus and learn more about what's driving the status quo, and are we feeling the heat of trauma, or are we feeling the heat of a positive transition to a new way of being? We have to be able to discern these things, and we have to take time to have those conversations, to be in dialogue, to focus together and truly get a deeper understanding. Third, we have to stay in a learning mode. The truth is we just can't think anymore that there are some people who get to know and they tell everyone else what to do. We don't live in that era anymore. We live in an era with distributed wisdom and leadership, with distributed knowledge. And we need to tap that knowledge through learning from one another, with one another. And that learning process is in and of itself a healing process. And the fourth variable that we found was this notion of focusing in on what are the results we're co-producing. Is it good enough? You know, we spend a lot of time in human services systems thinking, are we delivering the services right? But are we talking about, and you are, which is so refreshing, are they even the right services? Right? Do we even have the frame right? Do we have the values right? Do we have the actions right? And so we did something really simple. We just redefined service. In our dry contracts, it took me hours and hours to negotiate with our attorneys. We decided we weren't going to call services anymore these things that you do to change someone else. That is fundamentally disrespectful. And instead, a service was going to be any action that led to improvements in attitude and knowledge and skills and behavior and the status of a people. And that definition allowed local people to say what it was. What is a service in our lives, in our world? And they were through contract, stating what their belief was and learning and deepening that belief over time. And what we learned was that these four factors create a feedback loop, that when you focus and understand what's driving the status quo, you naturally are engaged in learning. Like, how do we change it? Do we do something different? Do we innovate? Do we try something different? How do we learn about it? And that naturally leads to a deeper reflection on whether we're being successful. Are we getting where we want to be? And when we have those deep conversations about who do we want to be for our grandchildren, for our great-grandchildren, that attracts all of the people that want to help, who've been staying away because they just don't trust bureaucracy. For good reasons, right? And so here come the expanded leaders, which enrich our resources and allow us to have more perspectives so that we can understand what's driving the status quo even more deeply. So we see this reinforcing loop that allows us to get better and better over time. And there are two kinds of work we saw in this. One kind of work I would call appreciative action, and the other kind of work in the science of physics is called emergence. And so I'm going to just introduce those two kinds of work that we saw and give you a few stories that will help illustrate how those kinds of work came about. So the first is appreciative action. And appreciative action is using positive and appreciatory participatory methods in order to learn what's generating the status quo, in order to understand the dreams and the aspirations and the hope of the people, to learn what works for whom. A lot of our standard methods for helping people haven't even looked at the question of what works for whom and in what context. The research is just looking at what works, as if we were all the same, and if all the community was the same. And lastly, this is the facilitation of continuous improvement. And what we found was that the traditional way of working with communities was self-limiting, meaning what we did was we said, you have to know in advance, the traditional way, you have to know in advance, then you write a grant. We say yes or no, there's a power differential. And you pretend that you know in advance what you can do, but you only propose the thing that you can win with, right? Because you want to get the next grant, you're already thinking about it. And that's not how we make bold action for healing, right? We have to incentivize doing the thing that we know in our hearts is the thing that will lead to transformational improvements. And so we have to shift the way we provide incentives for learning in our system. So what we know from the ACE study and from the data we've collected is that parent ACE scores right now, uninterrupted, are predicting child ACE scores. Everywhere in the world where we've been able to look at this, we see it clearly. Children with higher parental ACE scores are more likely to experience these kinds of stressors that complicate family life and bring about more difficulty for children growing up. And so we began to comb the literature and say, our communities are talking a lot about methamphetamines, they're talking a lot about heroin, they're talking about marijuana and alcohol. And what are those from a chemical standpoint? They're drugs that interact with our chemical reward system, with our dopamine. Dopamine allows us to anticipate pleasure. It actually facilitates that feeling in our bodies. And so we began to really study more about what helps with dopamine. And here's a little snippet of that. There are many things that can help with dopamine. But let me just say that infants deliver these social cues. They deliver them through eye contact and those wonderful sounds they make and touching. And that releases mom's oxytocin, the chemical that allows mom to have a preference for that human being. And that oxytocin triggers a release of dopamine. I can anticipate pleasure because of you, who you are, a unique person. And mom's dopamine creates attachment and ease with caregiving. And amazingly enough, it is this cycle in the earliest weeks and months of life that give the set point for the baby's level of dopamine when the baby becomes an adult. So the interaction of mom and baby has caused us to think differently about what is infant protection. And we began to see communities say, maybe we're thinking wrong about infant protection. Maybe child welfare and hospitals could come to agreement that infant protection is making sure that moms and babies, especially moms and babies that are drug affected, safely stay together through this period of time so that baby's dopamine can be set in a healthy way. We started to look at hope. This notion of hope has three parts. We can imagine a better future. We see a path to the future. We imagine that we could be on the path. And in communities where we had a lot of youth suicide and despair, they began to understand hope differently and build hope bus tours. They would pour the youth onto the buses and go around to different communities and say, see, life is different in different places. What dream do you have for your life? What could it look like? And over a decade later, those kids that went on Hope bus tours are coming back into their economically destitute communities and starting businesses because they've gone away. They've mined for that hope. They've understood what they wanted for their children and grandchildren, and they can now build it. I have to skip that because I'm getting a time signal. Emergence. I want to talk a little bit about emergence. Emergence is a part of the natural world. That we find that as new ways are building and connecting with each other, all of a sudden, whoosh, just like the steam, a new pattern emerges that can't be predicted by adding up all the parts that we just put together. A whole new reality comes about that has new capabilities, new power, and is surprising. So we can't write the grant and say, I'm planning on emergence and I'm going to do it by adding step 1 plus 2. You can't, it doesn't happen that way. That's not how in living systems emergence works. Emergence works by connecting up all of the promising and hope-filled ideas and actions until, whoosh, we see that whole new state come into being. And I don't know how many of you know the work of Dee Hock. Dee Hock, an amazing leader of a new form of organization he called the chaotic organization. Dee Hock founded Visa International, you know, the Visa card that you may have in your wallet or your purse. And he founded on the fundamental human need to exchange goods of value, to give and to receive. And he said, if we're going to have a world in which we appreciate difference and culture, we're going to need to be able to exchange value. And he says a true leader's behavior is induced by the behavior of every individual choosing where to be led. Leadership isn't about I know and I tell you. Leadership is about you share with me where you want to be led, and I open that space because I have the privilege to be able to open the space. And so we see in communities that are starting to realize, oh my goodness, we are the ones we've been waiting for. It is us, right? We're teaching a class, my colleague and I are teaching a class in Southern Oregon on the west coast of the United States, and we're teaching about this near science and emergence and the importance of mom and baby connecting. And one of the elders in the room jumps up from the back of the room and says, well, then we have to have grandmas to go. What? Yeah, okay. Well, what is grandmas to go, right? And she says, well, you know, you said that we have to have social engagement while we're calming the body, and we have to have belonging, and we have to have connection, and we have to have community, and we have to grow the leadership of young people. So can't I recruit dozens of grandmas that can just go walking with moms, and then we can develop all that? And I'm like, yes, you could do that. Let's go for it. And we come back only 2 weeks later, and this elder has already filed all the paperwork to have a nonprofit. She's recruited over a dozen grandmas. They're walking with moms, and they're like, we were already walking. We were just walking in the mall. We'd rather walk with these moms, right? We can't predict what will emerge that has profound impact for the lives of people. And as Dr. Anda and I have worked on ACE Interface, we've decided that the way we teach about adversity is really vital for how communities hold on to their power and exercise that power. And so we began to invest in training trainers who then are allowed to train others to present and teach. And in those training modules, we teach about cultural difference, we teach about emergence, and we teach about this near science. And we're beginning to see now communities who have these trainers who know how to talk about ACEs, but they also know how to be fully present with people, to facilitate weekly dialogue. In communities, one community where when we first started working with them, they said, we can't engage parents, parents just won't come. We're like, that doesn't make any sense, but okay, that's, you know, your truth. Now they have weekly parent conversation about adversity and what we want for our children and grandchildren. 20 to 50 parents every single week arriving, talking, dreaming, generating things like grandmas to go in their lives. So I want to just take a couple more minutes to explain to you a little bit about why teaching about NEAR has been such a fundamental part of this self-healing communities model. NEAR, remember neuroscience, epigenetics, ACEs, resilience. I like it because it reminds me about being near. And allowing people to think about what is the story of our lives? What is the story of your life, of my life? And what we find in the philosophy literature is this notion of that we have faculties of the mind. And that those faculties we might think of as consciousness. And one of those is reason, and another is memory, which tells us about our past. Another is imagination, which tells us about our future. And people who have a lot of adversity in their childhoods tend to have a particular story in their memory. And the problem with that story is that our reason is easily overwhelmed by the way our narrative is formed, the way our story is told to ourselves. And we tend to see that ACEs lead to people thinking about their lives as associated with shame and fear and hopelessness. A lot of people think what happened to me when I was a child is my fault, or I have these adaptations, although I don't think of them that way, I think of them as me being flawed. It's not a true story, but it's how people tend to internalize. And what that does is lead to limitations, our imagination about our future. We tend to think we're stuck in these fixed patterns, that we have to continuously have fear, that we just can cope. We certainly couldn't lead. And that we're always just going to feel this sense of hopelessness, that we can't see the better future. But what we find is that when people understand that you adapted just like you adapted, just like you, because we're human, that we shift the story of our lives, that we tell a different story about our past, and that leads to a different story about our future. We tell a story that is based on a reframing of our narrative. I adapted because I'm human. What I experienced was not my fault. And actually, my parents and grandparents were doing the best they could given what they knew and what they had experienced. I'm not alone, and I'm fundamentally good. And that allows me to write a new narrative for my future, that I can create new patterns, I can find hope and meaning and purpose, and that hope and meaning and purpose means that I can seek the truth, and I can love and be loved, and I can be a leader in my community. That new narrative is a resource, right? It is the gem in community that allows us to have this shift. There are principles, I'll talk to them about them tomorrow, and I just wanted you to see now in communities working with these living systems models, you can see the green line, those communities, these are ACE scores for population groups, 45 to 54, getting younger across. The green line were the communities we worked with, the red line's the other communities, and the percentage is the percent of people coming into adulthood with 3 or more ACEs. And you see here a plummeting of the percentage of people coming into adulthood with 3 or more ACEs. And what that delivers to us is stunning. Epidemiologists can calculate the amount of a disease that is caused by a disease agent. They call it population attributable risk. And so you see out along the outside of this some, but certainly not all, of the ACE attributable problems, the problems that we know have origin in adverse childhood experience. And the gray area in the middle is the percentage of each of these that is caused by ACEs, where ACEs are the origin of that percentage of the problem. 67% of suicide attempts, 69% of serious and persistent mental illness, 45% of drinking and driving, and you can read all the way around. Dr. Rob Anda said that he could have worked at the premier public health entity in the United States his entire career and won international awards for finding one disease agent that caused 2% of any one disease. And instead, he says he stumbled, although I think he didn't stumble, he stumbled into a disease agent that's driving huge percentage of many, many problems. And what that means is that as we reduce the ACE scores from one generation to the next, as we help communities into self-healing, we can solve huge percentage of all these problems concurrently. We don't have to wait one by one by one. We need to invest in the healing that will allow us to reduce all of them at once. And so I'm honored to be working with you to do that. I've loved meeting all of you, and I'll look forward to working with those of you that will be in the workshop tomorrow. Thank you.